I'm Curt Dupriez, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the Honda CR-V e-HEV RS long-termer that I've been punting around in for the last 6 months and 10,000 kilometres. And if you've watched my intro video to this SUV, and I hope that you have, you will know that I've nicknamed it Fred. Of course, after 6 months and 10,000 Ks, there's an awful lot to cover off in this final assessment. So this is part 1 of our final wrap-up, and part 2 will follow closely in its wheel tracks. Of course, we're going to cover off what this variant is, why we chose it, and what we've been doing with it for the last 6 months and 10,000 clicks. I'll reveal my 5 hits and 5 misses from the long burn experience of this hybrid SUV, and we'll decide whether or not we're keen to say adios to Fred or would be happy to ride off into the sunset in permanent ownership. We regularly have a variety of long-term loans in the Chasing Cars garage, and at the moment Fred is one of 4 different vehicles. That's because long-termers give the Chasing Cars team a more intimate experience than we usually get with the 1-week loans of press cars. It also means we can get different team members through the same car for different points of opinion. Of course, long-termers allow us to really see what reliability is like and to see if there are any deal breakers in the long burn experience. So let's kick off with what exactly Fred is and what exactly we've been doing with it for the last 6 months. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
The e-HEV RS continues to sit at the top of the CR-V tree. It remains the only hybrid powered CR-V in the entire lineup, with every other variant getting turbo petrol power. And as we've covered off many times before, it's only available as a front drive 5-seater, whereas you can get 7 seats and all-wheel drive in much more affordable variants down the range. So what hasn't changed is that all of Honda's hybrid eggs are parked in this pricey flagship basket. However, what has changed, particularly in the last 6 months of custodianship of Fred, is that there has been quite a few other hybrid midsize SUVs come onto the market. Relative hybrid newcomers are the Hyundai Tucson, the Kia Sportage and the Nissan X-Trail, and they're all taking on the sales juggernaut that is the Toyota RAV4. So where does our history with Fred start? Well, it was 6 months ago where it rolled into the Chasing Cars stable with around 4,000 kilometres on the odometer, so it was nicely run in. And due to slight mix-up, Fred wasn't waiting for us 5 kilometres from City HQ, but around 850 kilometres away in Melbourne. What would transpire is that I did manage to put around 1,000 kilometres under Fred's wheels in the first 48 hours, doing the Melbourne to City run via Echuca and Wagga Wagga. In fact, in the first month, we managed to clock up 3,000 kilometres in Fred, and that includes an awful lot of open road touring. Some of that grand touring included 2 round trips from Sydney to regional Victoria, and 1 trip when young Zach drove it from Sydney to the Sunshine Coast and back for a family holiday. Fred and the team have also been up and down the New South Wales coast, as well as 2 trips to Canberra, including 1 as a support vehicle for our EV megatest. But the rest of the time, Fred was essentially a city-based daily runabout. The result, after 6 months, is a fairly even 50-50 split between 5,000 kilometres on the open road and 5,000 kilometres in the big smoke. And with that, we have a good idea about what Fred's like as a real-world Aussie family proposition. So let's dive into my 5 hits and 5 misses in no particular order to see how the experience has panned out. Hit number 1 is Fred's vibe. Now, I banged on about how much I like the exterior styling well enough in the introductory video, but there's more to it than that. Fred always gives me a little lift when I see it for the first time before every drive. But then you climb in and the black leather-dipped interior makes for a feel-good 1-2 hit. It does make for a cracking combination. And while you can get the Ignite red paint and the 19 wheels on the lower grade LX all-wheel drive, it does miss out on a few details that are on the flagship. And that's because the RS gets black highlights where it's silver on much of the rest of the range. So it's the only one that gets body-coloured wheel arches and side skirts. Needless to say, there are no complaints on the outside, but that's not necessarily the case when you climb inside. Hit the start button, and after a little bit of a ceremony, you're presented with a disclaimer on the 10.2-inch touchscreen. I read it once and it says something about the driver being master of the ceremonies or some sort of rubbish like that. Whatever the case, that disclaimer comes back to haunt you every time you restart the car. And if you don't hit OK in acknowledgement, the screen goes black, so no media for you. It is silly and it's unnecessary, and honestly, Honda, leave the disclaimer stuff for signing the paperwork at the dealership. That dealt with, you then have to turn off the road departure mitigation system every time you try and drive the car. And that's because the system is so pervasive and poorly calibrated that it will drive you bonkers. Using the roller on the right hand side of the steering wheel, you can turn it off in 3 easy steps, but you do have to do it every time you start the car. And on the topic of other painful processes on startup is that If you want to swap between one phone to another with a media system, it is very clumsy and difficult to do. Having to negotiate all of this at the supermarket while someone waiting for your car space gives you death stares gets very tiring very quickly. But hit number 2 is that despite those few foibles, that's as bad as it gets for an otherwise fantastic cabin. If you spent any time in the old CR-V, you will appreciate how much of a quantum leap this new generation is in terms of look, design and execution. It has a really appealing classic vibe, one that's really neat and very mature. It's not really overly techy here, but what it does bring, like the 12.3-inch driver screen, is very welcoming and very easy to use. What's really appealing to me is that it really avoids that kind of propped up SUV vibe inside. The front row feels lengthy and quite low slung, so it's more like you're driving a lowered wagon or a sporty crossover. And on that, the black and silver theme has a really sportiness to it that really does match the RS theme. And that's mirrored in some of the details. I really love these neat vents. Fantastic steering wheel, and the seats are very excellent. There's a real premiumness here that kind of lifts it out of the SUV mainstream, but you would expect that for something that's 60 grand on road. Now, my last long termo, the Lexus RX, was blessed with some of the nicest pews in motoring, and I've got to say the CR-V's RS spec gives it a good run for its money. Now, the leather appointment isn't quite as supple as you would find in the Lexus. However, it is more durable and hard wearing. Speaking of wear and tear, after 10,000 kilometers, it still feels daisy fresh in here. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Honda has resisted using shiny piano black on a lot of the touch points. As I said earlier, the vibe in the cabin always brings some feel-good factor to each and every trip. And not simply because it looks great, because it's so ergonomically sound. All the controls fall neatly to hand, everything's logically placed, and it's just a really simple thing to operate and drive. And that hit number 2 keeps on coming here in the second row, where you get plenty of space and lots of comfort. Knee room's excellent, toe room's excellent, headroom's pretty acceptable, but you also get plenty of neat appointments as well. The seat base is nice and high and the window sills are low, and the kids are going to love that. But you also get a nice flat floor and there's tilt adjustment on the seat. And a lot of this stuff we have covered off in reviewing the CR-V before, but what I really want to anchor here is just how well packaged this is as a 5-seater. Which brings us neatly to miss number 2. The RS isn't available as a 7-seater as it is in more affordable versions of the CR-V further down the range. But frankly, for me, that's only a narrow miss, because this CR-V does work a hell of a lot better as a 5-seat format. Now, the 5-seater gets 581 litres of luggage space. And when you do drop the second row, that expands to over 1,600 litres as a 2-seater to the ceiling. Opt for the 7-seater and you only get 150 litres of boot space with all seats in play. So my hot take on this is that the CR-V, or any mid-size SUV for that matter, is best served as a 5-seater where it's most smartly packaged. And when you do try and squeeze 7 occupants in 3 rows in this CR-V form, you end up with more compromises than benefits. When you add third row seats, you lose roominess, comfort, and ultimately practicality. That is unless, of course, that you're using all 7 seats regularly and most of your occupants are kids. Still, some owners like to shove their loved ones into SUVs like sardines, but ultimately there's no 7-seat option in RS trim. So on balance, it's a case of so far so good for Fred. But what about that hybrid system? How about fuel economy and how the CR-V drives on the road? And then there's a matter of long burn reliability and ownership credentials. And crucially, are we keen to say adios to Fred, or would we be happy to continue on with the experience for years to come? Stay tuned for part 2 of our CR-V review coming up very soon.